So it occurred to me today after my son unked me for the 97th time in a row. When you get unked, it means that you're like the old guy giving out advice. And apparently, shock of shocks, my son has decided to uh, officially consign me to the persona of unk. So I'm just going to lean into it. And of course, unk on life, like kunk on life. I'm probably not as funny as she is. But anyway, we're going to give this a shot. So, of course, over the weekend, the Pope Francis, was buried, and now we are officially in the phase where everyone goes crazy about, suddenly everyone's uh, an expert on all things papal and all that sort of stuff. And I guess that's sort of what I'm doing here too. Although I don't pass myself as an expert on papal matters as such, but as someone who pays attention, decently well informed layman, and all of that. But um, I am struck that his presence will linger over the conclave. Naturally, he was in office for 12 or 13 years, 12 and a half years. And, that's a long time. That's a half of a lifetime ago if you are, say, 25. And I got to thinking, especially as I've been mixing it up online, I was on a couple of shows. And of course, you know me, I can't stay away from X. And so much of the conversation is about Francis. But interestingly, at least in my circles and orbits, there's been a lot of chatter about John Paul II. And my sense is that if you are young, you have a very distinct version of John Paul II, which is almost as frustrating to me as those folks who were 10 years up and older than I am. So I'm 52. So those people in their 60s and older also have a take on John Paul II that I think is worth talking about. The sort of the two John Paul IIs, and the first crew, those, let's say, that are fans of John Paul II and believe and were inspired by him. I count myself among those people, of course, but with a little bit of nuance here. What is striking to me is that they look back favorably at a papacy, a sort of era defining papacy from, what is it, 1978 to 2004, 2005. So a big, big chunk of time. And, you know, you have to remember that a pope exists in a very specific time and in a very specific context. And it's easy to forget, for instance, that John Paul II is elevated to the papacy a mere 10 years after the thereabouts, 10 years after the promulgation of the Mass of Pope Paul VI, the so-called Novus Ordo. And so the church had undergone extraordinary and convulsive changes in the decade prior to John Paul II's elevation. John Paul II, of course, was a participant in the Second Vatican Council. I believe he was already the Bishop of Krakow then, but anyway, I could be wrong. Sorry, I haven't read my big copy of Witness to Hope in a long time. George Weigel's book actually is very good. It's worth reading, but it is a doorstopper of a book. But anyway, let's just recall that a mere 10 years had passed since the lived reality of all of the world's Roman Catholics changed radically and perhaps inexorably, right? That the council, as experienced by most rank and file Catholics, is the new Mass. And so not only did the new Mass change things from a Latin liturgy into a vernacular liturgy, but also the whole feel of it was altered and changed. And there were a number of notable changes, and there are a lot of options that a priest can use. And of course, the priest goes from facing the altar to facing the people, from ad orientem to ad populi, or so. I think that's the Latin expression, right? And, you know, those were massive, massive changes. And so Pope John Paul II, as a theologian and as a pastor, was more concerned, it seems to me, with the role of the church in the modern world, much more so. Even his fans will say that he was not particularly concerned with liturgy. And but the moment that he enters into the world scene, there are real theological questions that he is obsessed with as a theologian himself, and how to interpret the documents of the Second Vatican Council. And so he spends a long time, he writes a great amount, both in terms of encyclicals, but also his audiences on the theology of the body and all this. And just by temperament, a man who had lived through Nazi occupation and then Soviet occupation and eventual the Polish communist government, he was remarkably sanguine in his outlook. He believed in the gospel and the gospel's power to transform the hearts and minds of moderns. And so his whole papacy was an outward facing papacy. And in part, he was embodying a kind of interpretation of the Second Vatican Council. And it's easy to forget that the fights over the interpretation of the council were real. The fights over the interpretation, you had a group of people who saw it as a sort of a work of continuity. Then Cardinal Ratzinger was part of that in the Communio school, but you had a Concilium school who thought that the Second Vatican Council did not go nearly far enough. And so John Paul's papacy was a kind of living interpretation of the Second Vatican Council. And you can poke holes in this. You could say, well, what good is a council if it requires, 25 years of interpretation? Fair enough, and we can have another argument and discussion about that at another time. But that is really what he was doing. And so also recognize that you have a world coming out of the convulsive destruction of the world wars as well. And so much of his papacy was oriented toward trying to build a new and better world. Also, at the time, of course, it's important to recognize that there's a first world, there's a second world, and there's a third world. The first world is sort of the modern West, Europe and America and those countries, and then you had the second world, which were the communist bloc nations, and then you had the third world, which was sort of almost like the proxy spaces where these wars of interpretation, these wars were working themselves out. And it occurred to me today that both the first world and the second world were making a proposal to the peoples for a particular vision of freedom. So for the second world, their vision of freedom was not what the West was selling, but was freedom from oppressive capitalism. The first world, of course, was arguing for this sort of liberal freedom of the autonomous individual. And the church, in that fight, of course, John Paul II sided with the West, but I think he offers an interesting critique of both of those visions, those impoverished visions of freedom. I think that is lost in the noise of the current moment. Of course, then Ratzinger is elevated as Benedict XVI, and all of those people who did not care for John Paul II's interpretation of the Second Vatican Council were waiting for him to die, and they were waiting for him to die for a really, really long time. And one of the things I said on a podcast or on a Twitter thread or what have you is that if there had been X during especially the last decade of John Paul II's papacy, it would have been quite something to see the negativity around John Paul II. But alas, a lot of that chatter was saved for the theology classrooms and the various chanceries around the world. But make no mistake about it, John Paul II, as much as he was beloved by the people, was loathed by the theological establishment. And big portions of the Catholic leadership and hierarchy did not care for him and wanted a different interpretation of the Second Vatican Council. Benedict, of course, comes in. He resigns famously, giving us Jorge Bergoglio, who became Pope Francis I. And so these past 12 years have been interesting. A lot of us, I would include myself in this, I thought that division that was proposed by the Concilium School or the Bologna School or these various modernizing movements within the church, I thought that they had lost the day and they were done and they were out to pasture. Was I wrong? I was very, very wrong. In fact, there was a newfound kind of energy around this alternative vision of the Second Vatican Council. And I think that Pope Francis elevated those elements. Now, I don't think that that is going to win in the end, because the inspiration of really John Paul II, but certainly for the academically minded Benedict XVI, they inspired a large cohort of young men in particular to enter the seminary. So you have a priest cohort, especially those in later Gen X, and all the millennials essentially are much more conservative than the bishops and the elderly clergy. Right? So that's an interesting data point. And so, what are they going to sort of preside over? Maybe they really will preside over that smaller church, famously predicted by then Monsignor Ratzinger. I think he was. Maybe he was bishop then, but by a younger Ratzinger in 1969. Okay, so why am I talking about this? You've heard all this sort of stuff. Okay. This conclave is really interesting, especially when you look at the conclave in the makeup of those cardinal electors. And remember, you can't be older than 80. So this is the first fully or majority or massively boomer generation conclaves. And now, on the one hand, you might go, oh my gosh, then we're totally screwed. Oh my gosh, the boomers, what are they going to do? But I think, you could say there's a difference between early boomers and late boomers. That's fine. But I think to have been someone who lived through the papacies of John Paul II and Benedict XVI, and then to go through the sort of I think it's fair to say, tumultuous 12 years of Francis, I wonder how they are going to see what is needed for the church as they enter into the conclave. But there's a lot of stuff going on in that regard. But Francis, I don't know, there was no Francis effect, really, in terms of inspiring young men to enter the priesthood. Now, one curious thing I was thinking about this morning, I was talking about the enduring influence of now deceased former Cardinal Theodore McCarrick, once the Cardinal Archbishop of Washington, D.C., who, of course, blew up in the Summer of Shame as it became revealed that he was a monster, a sexual monster. And apparently, lots of people knew about this. I've written about this. You can look it up, just how much it rocked my world. But I remember there was a video of him in the aftermath of the elevation of Pope Francis. And he was essentially bragging at a talk at Villanova about how he and a few fellow travelers and an Italian gentleman basically rigged, maybe that's too much to say, but exerted great influence on the conclave that gave us Pope Francis. Many of his nephews are still in positions of power. What has become increasingly clear to me as I've watched the scene as a layman is that the people who run the church have no idea, or they just simply don't care about the lack of moral authority through the sexual abuse crisis. And it continues to stagger the imagination. that they just still don't get it. So how much of an influence do those guys still have in terms of swaying a conclave, or is it enough? So we'll see. I don't want to sort of get into. I'm not making any predictions because I have no idea what's going to happen. But just as someone who pays attention to these things, I have been interested in working through kind of there's the sort of the fourth turning model of generations and how it's going to affect this our next pope. I don't think it's a stacked or rigged conclave the way that some people talk about it. I just don't think that's how these things work. The one thing that Francis did do, which is I think really interesting, is he has made the conclave much less Roman centric and much more far flung to the peripheries. And so you're going to have a cardinal conclave that involves a lot of people who really don't know each other that well. They have not been to a bunch of these gatherings. And so I think that could be interesting. So maybe that means there's going to be a super long conclave. I know the political operators are going to try to make this fast because I think a fast conclave, one that comes to a quick decision, serves entrenched interests in Rome. So I think the longer it goes on, that might be an indication of a cardinal conclave class getting to know one another through the iterations of votings. So that will be something interesting, I think, to read. But Francis hovers over this conclave. Interestingly enough, John Paul II hovers over this conclave. And, my trad friends, I think, have a mistaken view of what John Paul II was in his context. I'm familiar with all the anti-John Paul II talking points, but I don't feel like they fully take into account the idea of an historical context. So we're in a new historical context right now. It's 2025, and Europe has its own crises, but the world has its own crises, and this could be quite something. So anyway, that's a little bit of Unk talk. Unk on life here on the YouTubes. And if you like this, please leave a message. And let me know if you have a topic you want me to cover here for these short little YouTube shows that I'm doing. But until then, I'm Cale Zeldin. I am on the YouTube here. If you could hit like and subscribe, you can go over to my Substack and take a look at that. And until then, have a great day. God bless. Godspeed. Be well, my friends.